First of all, good evening, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. And this is the first time we are presenting our office in Lithuania. It's actually the first time any of us in the office has been in Lithuania, so there's also a special note to that. And as Yeva was saying, we decided to try something else. Very often when we do a lecture, we tend to present the last 3 projects or the most important 2 projects or something like that. Today, for the first time, I'm going to try to show every project we ever did. It's going to be intense. It's going to be fast. It's going to be fast-paced. And I would be very happy at the end to have a conversation, to answer questions, I heard there are philosophers in the room, so I would be very excited with that. But first of all, I have to say, what is Fala? I mean, to add to what Yeva said before. And I would divide Fala into 2 main answers. So one answer is a group of people, a group of friends actually, that has been working together for about 10 years, 10, 12 years. It's difficult to say when we started. 5 out of 7 people have been together since the beginning, so we know each other quite well. We finish each other's sentences, and as I said, we are friends. We have babies. 3 years ago, there were no babies in the office. Now there are 6 of them, which somehow we also see as an extension of the office themselves, as a sort of collective endeavor. But besides being a group of people, besides being a team, Fala is a collection of fictions. Fictions in the sense of projects, drawings, publications, texts, presentations. I would say tonight adds 1 more fiction to this collection of fictions. And we often like to show it like this, not as a set of individualities, but as a group of islands that define an archipelago. And this archipelago is, to the most extent, the production of the office. What we every day join forces to do, what we every day try to extend and to expand. And this office started in many different ways. We worked together in Switzerland, we studied together in some schools, we had some points in common here and there, but most important, we have a certain fascination for architecture. Architecture with capital A, architecture as a discipline. And more specifically, and this is the bookshelf from Ahmed, about a specific period of architecture in Japan. A period between 65, 85, where we believe most of the most outstanding houses were being built. And in that period, so taking a quote from the beginning of that period and a quote from the end of that period, there are several architects we admire tremendously. But I would start by saying that we deeply agree with Kazuo Shinohara. We believe that the work we do, not just houses, every project we do, is to a certain extent a work of art. Not because we are artists, but because we believe our work engages with society. And seeing a full room tonight really contributes to this thinking of ours that there's something we have to do besides giving a house to those who commission us. But it's very obvious, going to Itsuku Asegawa, that none of our clients cares about that. So we are commissioned to do houses, to renovate apartments, to do commercial work. That's normally the commission we'll receive. And it's our ambition to do the first, to still do a sort of artistic production. And because we also teach and we research, so we are not just designing buildings, we have published a few books over the years. This was the first book, the first real book we published, the book on these houses. Whoa. On this specific period, where we decided to document that bookshelf, but instead of keeping it as a collection of magazines that we knew exactly in which page we would find that specific house from that specific architect, we just compiled it as a single book, a book that has no text. Each spread shows a house, each house has a few drawings that were redrawn, a few photos from the original publications, and that's it. And it defines a list, a compendium, a sort of pulp of the period that we admire so much. And a few years later, actually last year, we published a second book, very similar in idea, but instead of looking at a generation that is far from us, very far on the other side of the planet and in another time and place, to look at the generation that surrounds us. So instead of being the young office from Porto, putting ourselves as the oldest office in a publication of young practices within our country. And that's what we did. We documented them, we photographed them together with Atelier Local and the photos by Francisco Ascensão. And then we invited all of these foreign guests to reflect on them. So instead of asking a Portuguese architect to say what he sees, we asked foreign architects from very, very far to do that reflection. And by doing that reflection, and you can see this is the plastic that covers the book. When you remove the plastic, the authors disappear. what we are left with is with a book of photography of a generation of new architecture coming away from Portugal, phenomenal architecture I would say, a generation with insane talent but very limited means and very limited resources. And by not naming the photos, by not listing them, forcing whoever sees this book to see this generation as a group, as a collective force to be tackled. But contrary to the Japanese book, with texts, the text from the guests, the text from the foreign critics, the foreign thinkers, that without knowing any of these offices had to make a reflection out of it. So suddenly the word becomes important. And the third book that I'm going to talk about tonight is a book we are doing right now, a book about shitty architecture. The architecture that composes our cities, mostly Porto in this case, because it's the field we decided to study. Buildings that were designed in the 60s and in the 70s that to a large extent do not have architects involved. They were done by draftsmen, by construction companies, but they define the rice and potatoes of our urban mesh. And we believe that they are so gloriously good that it's worth trying to understand why. And so it's a kind of nostalgic exercise, but it helps to frame these three obsessions of ours. Japan illustrates precedent, what comes before us within the discipline that we admire so much. The book on the new generation reflects on our context. Where do we belong today? And this on our guilty pleasures, because there are things that are difficult to explain. But in all of them, the level of research and depth we take into the investigation is quite deep. And these are not paid projects, so we do them because I honestly don't know. But we do them anyway, and we believe we should do them well and we should do them in depth. At the same time, besides the research projects we do, we teach. And there's this quote from Kipnis that we find to be quite interesting. That is the importance to understand that it's important to misbehave. And we believe that misbehave is a fundamental act towards or against commercial architecture and the state of the art of 99.9% of construction. And our position while teaching is a bit about this, about teaching our students to understand that they have to be free thinkers. So many of the exercises we do, they happen around words, around discussions, around talking. So we spend a lot of time speaking with each other, trying to find ways to explain what we're going to do before we do it, not making it just a frivolous exercise of form and taste. At the same time, we have no problem in assuming that we emulate, that we personify our heroes, that we try as much as possible to get as close as we can to Peter Merkley, Venturi Scott Brown, Kazuo Shinohara, Itsuko Asegawa, Maribot, and a few others. People that to us are sort of religious figures that we look up to on a daily basis, that we emulate. We teach our students through drawing because, as it's common in universities, students don't build that much. Thankfully, they just draw. But we teach them how to draw and how to think through drawing. So the drawing both as a tool and as a thinking process. Not just the drawing as a plan and a section and elevation, but a drawing as a project. So each drawing is worth for itself. And in some recent years, I would say, our focus has been slowly gravitating towards collective housing for several reasons I will explain ahead, but most importantly because there's an insane crisis of housing right now happening in Portugal, I would say all over Europe. There's an opportunity for a discussion, and maybe, if not the public sector is having it in schools, we should be able to accommodate it. And the lecture I'm going to present today, it's called Good Housing. And good housing is not a classification. So it's not like if we are saying what we do is good housing. Good housing is an objective. It's an objective because I think everyone understands what housing means. Everyone knows what housing is. Everyone lives somewhere. And good is an adjective that we also all understand. So as an objective to do good housing, it's what motivates us in the office. And in recent years, it's what has been motivating us in teaching and research also. 2 years ago, we published or we were invited to publish a monography from A+U in Japan. And in that monography, we divided all our work into 7 chapters. You can see the chapters here that define a poem, the archipelago within regularity, from and for joy of fragile systems, ornaments of life, another honesty, and choreographed fictions. And for each of these chapters, we invited a guest, a foreign guest, a friend, a practitioner, to say something about that specific chapter, that specific work. But more important than individual chapters, it was important to us to talk about the whole, the totality of the work. And I thought this was a very inspiring idea for a book, but never for a lecture, because it would be too long. But as I said before, let's try it. It's important to say we started in Japan in 2013, specifically in that building over there that was demolished recently, in this capsule, the one with the blue shutter. And me and Anna were living there, and we were very certain after working a few months in Japan that we don't want to work for anyone else anymore in our lives. This is very obvious. And we wanted to start a practice without clients, without commissions, without work, but with a huge ambition that doing architecture was gonna, find its way. While living in the Nakagin, we did our first research project, documenting the few resisting inhabitants of the building, photographing them, interviewing them, understanding what made them so special and what made that building also so peculiar. And on the bottom right corner, you see Anna in our capsule. In our office at the time, there was a desk and there was a wall to put some pages. And it seems ridiculous today, but it was very important at that time. When we came back to Portugal, this ambition of showing, of researching, of communicating became evident, and we applied for a collective project to the Triennale in Lisbon, and we displayed with the same level of negligence the building that we had lived in within a very old palace, but also through a floating structure like the building itself. With the months that followed, we started to have specific commissions, not glorious projects, not the museums that our professors promoted and told us we were going to do, not the big schools, not big housing blocks, apartments, transforming a 50 square meters apartment into a 50 square meters better apartment, transforming a small garage into a house, not through the typological experimentation, but because it was a cheap piece of land for a couple that had not more money. And we started to understand that maybe, at least as a start, our projects were going to be just that. Reinventions, iterations, corrections. So not really the dream we were sold, not just in school, but in the offices we worked, but the reality of the market. We were in the crisis. Portugal was really at the bottom of the crisis. There was no money, there was no labor because most of the workers migrated abroad, and the commissions were coming from economical need, not from architectural desire. And we had no portfolio, we had nothing to show, so we had to play with what we found. This painting from Baldessari is quite important to us. The idea that we were noticing more and more that we were operating with given structures, with books that were already written by someone else. And to us it was very clear that respecting heritage or respecting pre-existing conditions meant erasing the cover, starting again. Accepting that it's a book, it has a format, it has a certain number of pages, and it has an history, and it was read by many people, but now it's our book and we have the right to change that. And funny commissions started to appear here and there. How to transform a clothing factory that tried to look like a house into a housing block that felt more like a factory than before. And how to do it with pretty much 200 euros per square meter. I don't know how is the economy in Lithuania, but in Portugal that's not enough to do anything. So how to do a lot with very, very, very little. At the same time, finding here and there an opportunity to operate in a different context. If in here we are in the middle of the mountain where industrial debris still happen, in the middle of the city, facing the backyard where no one else except maybe the window from this lady and a couple of other plots can see, make a back facade the main facade. The main facade not because it is the public facade, because the public facade is very often in old buildings protected for the heritage department to show to tourists, because tourists matter more than inhabitants in Portugal. But the back facade is the main facade for private use. So imagine a main facade that only the users and a couple of neighbors could actually see and celebrate. And that was very exciting to us because it was the sort of questioning that Kipnis was referring, a sort of misbehave, investing everything in the back, ignoring the front. And by playing with specific local materials, materials that feel luxurious but are actually quite cheap, I have to say, with the simplest catalog windows and with a bit of taste, trying to find a very luxurious, non-luxurious facade. With time, we moved to our current office. So for many years, we worked in a shoebox office, 20 square meters, 7, 8 people. And then we finally managed to move to our current office where we are still 7, 8 people, but we have space, we have a garden, we have conditions. But at the same time, to design our houses. And we live above our office in the same building that we work is the same building where we live. When I say we, I mean me, Anna, and Ahmed, although Ahmed now left for his own house. And in this space, understanding that it is as important for us to understand reconstruction, the beam that holds the building, the new element, but also playfulness, both the double door that opens to the living room, but also the small door that opens to the cat. So all of these things became architecture to us. So architecture was not just about the big plan and the big master plan, it was about that small rectangle. There was architecture showing up in things that before we did not consider to be architecture. And this is the building. The office is the ground floor. That is actually a basement level facing the street, because once again this is the back. So we started celebrating the back. The back facade matters, the front facade not so much. And above, Ahmed's apartment and mine and Anna's apartment. And this idea of designing facades happened here and there, and suddenly, because we insisted so much on these publications, on the sharing of our work, we got invited by cultural institutions to do what we could call cultural work. Not museums, not schools, pavilions, the sort of architecture that young offices tend to do. The one on the left in Porto, a small pavilion for an art piece in Serralves. The one on the right in Belgium for a summer festival, for a dance festival. And in these buildings, suddenly the idea of expression became more evident, because they are light, they are fast, they are not meant to last, they are not judged by the municipality and the public actors, so we got a bit freer. Of course, we played with wood, with paint, the materials that were available, but it gave us, these buildings, they gave us the idea that there can be more. We can expand our vocabulary. At the same time, in the interior of the projects we were designing, the discovery of that Japanese generation brought us to Kazuo Shinohara. Kazuo Shinohara brought us to a certain idea of fictionality, a certain idea of meaning space, main space versus secondary space, new words. So suddenly it was not about bedroom versus living room, it was about main versus secondary. Kazuo Shinohara impacted a lot of other architects in that generation, Toyo Ito being one of them, and the White Hue is one of the most quintessential works of that period. And the houses we started to design, they stopped being houses that had a basic program, as I said, 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 1 living room, and they started having main spaces versus secondary spaces. We started composing not a living room, but a space. And suddenly form became a device that allowed us to place this tiny point that is a column, but it's a fictional column, like a column from Takamatsu that is and is not a column at the same time. It's a column that is not structural, so a column that is not holding a building in an engineering sense, but it's holding the space in an architecture sense, therefore doesn't touch the ceiling. So it's a column that behaves to organize a before and after such column, but not to hold weight. And this was very important to us. Now we did a few of them, but at the time this was like, whoa, the most radical thing we have ever achieved. We convinced the client to do a column that doesn't hold nothing. And the house is a house within the context where we come from. This is actually in Anna's hometown, in a small village around Porto, where you see that all houses, they face on the side towards the street. They are very much trying to be different from each other, but they all look the same. In our house, just one floor tries to look at the people arriving and kind of blinks and says something to them. As we started to have a mix of projects, so not just houses, not just apartments anymore, but buildings. Not buildings in the sense of big buildings, but small buildings. We started to understand that more often than not, we would have to operate with a word that became fundamental, the perimeter. The perimeter as a frame that is given, that we cannot change, because there's the building on the right, the building on the left, there's the wall on the back, there's the street on the front. But trying to understand how we can reconfigure the interior through an architectural idea, an architectural concept, and in this case, a gravity point, another column that holds nothing, in this case, a fireplace, that is simultaneously Gothic, full of ornament, full of intentions, but also surreal. A sort of column that is holding a door that every time that it's open, it's closed, that holds several doors at the same time. And then color. What was radical to us in the beginning, to paint something with color, became normal. A floor can have color, a ceiling can have color, doors can have color. And the same color that does project A changes for project B. And if in project A, all the doors are actually touching the column, so the column holds the doors, in project B, the doors run away from the column. So suddenly, column A is a perfect square, column B is a very fragmented and decomposed figure. And this column B sits at the center of a house that is 3 levels, a house that has no design, a house that is actually very dry, made out of straight lines, but the column is not. And excess of form within such a column allows us to do the stoppers of the doors, but allows us, above all, to give personality to such column. And maybe that column doesn't need to touch the floor. So it's like the column from a few minutes ago, but upside down. And why is this so important? As you can see in the wireframe on the right, It gives you a center of gravity to the house, so the top 2 levels with private rooms, they navigate around the column. The bottom level, that is the public space, liberates itself from the column and forces whoever passes to understand this column is not holding anything, it's organizing space. This column is 100% an architectural device and 0% an engineering device. And the back facade, once again, the back facade is the main facade. And so we stopped fighting the municipalities because we understood they are idiots, there's nothing we can do about it. We started celebrating the back facade. And suddenly, it's as if we are giving a treasure to the city that the city cannot enjoy. I know it sounds arrogant, but it's how we felt about it at the time. We were even younger than we are now. And in the houses that followed, we started playing with the municipality. On the left, the front facade, on the right, the back facade, both built from scratch. But the front facade with a series of rules on metrics and proportions, and bullshit rules as if we have to design facades today as if we are in the 19th century still. But on the back, no one cares. No regulation, no one to judge what to do. So the project started having this sort of complicated existence, as if they are 2 things at the same time. Inside, plasticity became more and more evident. So suddenly, not only we could use color, we could use form in flat surfaces. We can paint color with a certain form. We can provide a certain frivolous but very rich expression to elements that would be otherwise just flat white surfaces. And the collection of all these surfaces, so the collection of all of these painted surfaces, the semicircles, the stripes, the different elements, through a wireframe show the richness of the project. So a house, before being a house, it's already inhabited. It's inhabited by such columns, it's inhabited by such patterns, it's inhabited by the intentions that we left as authors. Other houses, because not all clients are the same, are very formally rich, although plastically very tamed. This is a very limited resources house in the suburbs of Porto. Whereas you can see a sequence of private spaces keeps growing and the big social space of the house connects all of them. You will also notice that we avoid as much as possible circulation spaces, corridors, spaces that obey to a single function. And once again, the main space versus the secondary spaces of the house is quite evident and clear. This is the plan. And what happens here is that you start to see there are certain themes that became more and more evident. Squares, quarters of circle, diagonals, 45 degrees. Certain geometrical figures that not only we inherited from that postmodern period in Japan, but that became obsessions of ours through other sources and other means. The house on the outside looks a bit like a swan from certain angles. Some people say it looks like a weird church. But what is important to us is that it is a house that results in its form and expression from a series of logical arrangement and plan decisions that came a priori. So form is truly important to us, but form is not the driving factor, it's the result and the conclusion of the study. And when we look at it from other angles, we can also not ignore the fact that we are looking at more things. It's not just Japan, it's not just Switzerland, there's CISA, there's America, there's a lot of Belgium these days, there's a lot more to inform our production. And of course, the collection of these houses, and the more houses we built, the more it became evident, proved to us that maybe the houses we were doing, they were not trying to belong. Or if they were belonging, they were belonging in contrast, in antithesis to the context they belonged to. And this is a very specific drawing from Kazuo Shinohara, from the Uehara house from '76, where he felt the need to explain the house in France, to draw the whole houses of the street so that, people in France could understand how far he was from that context. And this is a house we did 3 years ago, in the suburbs of Porto again. And we do this image in black and white because it is really important to see how all houses around are so different from each other, but so much the same. And our house rotates itself 90 degrees regarding the street, inverts the slope of the street, has the living room below and the private spaces above. So there's a series of misbehaviors that make her unique, but that we like to believe that in 20, 30 years we're going to look back at it and it's just another one within so many others that look the same. Because every single one of these houses also felt it was unique at its time. So in a way we try to run away, but maybe we belong. This house is absolute on the ground level. It's a kind of translucent box that relates with the garden, that relates with the view, that is supported by these green columns that are structural, that actually hold the building this time. And on the top level, the relations of geometries form, both in plan and section, start deconstructing it. So we tried very hard at this moment to not only separate main from secondary, but making the secondary spaces to a certain extent as special as the main spaces. not through scale, not as the same size, because the needs did not require that, but through spatial configuration and formal expression. This is an idea that we had brought from older projects. I mean, this is actually out in the timeline. It happened way before. A project where with pretty much no money, we had to reconvert a ruin into a house for a single lady. And this single lady had just very limited resources and very limited requirements, a small storage space, a small bedroom, a small bathroom, and all of those hide behind the blue doors. And the rest of the space is just painted and treated, allowing one curve to solve the plan, and then the existing roof to be cladded in metal sheets, and contrasting with the granite existing walls, defining an interiority that is not part of this universe anymore. And this cheap construction, because most times we do projects in the first 5-6 years, around 400 euros per square meter, which in a way was exciting, but actually highly limitative and a bit annoying, because deep down we want to spend more money, but there was no money to spend. And the second project we did with the same technology or with the same set of resources was this one, a collection of 6 houses in the garden in the city center of Porto, within a very dense urban block. And with very limited means, and you can see here, the back of the back of the back of the city, creating a universe that was our first public space. Because although this garden is just for the users of this collection of houses to use, it is shared. So it's a private public space that is made with 1.5 thousand euros, so just earth, some grass, and a couple of trees. And the houses, the 6 houses, you can see 5 on the top and 1 isolated. This is the ground floor and the top floor. They are 20 square meters each, so very, very, very small, but geometrically very rich. So the lack of space to us stopped being a problem and started being an opportunity. If we have less space, maybe we should be even more radical in the formal experimentation. And at the same time, we are building the smallest houses. A few meters away, we are building the biggest single-family house we did at the time. This was a flower depot on the ground floor of a building. It's about 150 square meters, plus a garden on that side. So you enter on the street and you cross through, and we convinced the clients not to do any partitions. So to have a small storage space, a bathroom, and a sort of private bedroom, office, whatever space, and allowing the living area to be a longitudinal continuous space. This is not a new idea. I already showed a plan of this Toyorito house today. But the idea that you have a sort of dramatic living experience instead of a traditional one was very important to us. And as we are friends with his clients and we visit the house over the years, it's a very happy coincidence, or not a coincidence, actually a logical conclusion, to see how this house has been inhabited over the years. Furniture changes, chair changes. They had a kid recently. We were afraid they were going to sell it and move somewhere else. The kid lives there also, and the kid is now 2 years old. So it's interesting to see how the norms that the market, and the market is the enemy, impose to us are not norms. They are just the convention that we take to accept, and some people, at least these people, they manage to live without such norms. And what is interesting is that depending on the season of the year, the house becomes more of a garden or more of a plaza or more of a living space. And the question of main versus secondary is taken to a limit. There's just main space. There's no secondary space. There's just one living experience for a family. As I said before, Ahmed did his own house at some point, and he was very excited with the idea of doing a similar typology to the one I just showed. So he found another garage, another flower depot. In this case was a shirt depot for a clothing factory that was extended all the way to the back with the garden. The garden becomes an oasis in the city center. So imagine a tiny piece of land that you can plant in a moment where you just have a continuous mesh of buildings. On the inside, the house goes through once again. There's no main or secondary once more. There's just a few storage spaces and, let's say, living devices behind the wall on the left. And then at the right, what we could call a public space, and on the left, a bed space, but both of them separated by glass brick wall that does not give a true separation between both. And on the back, from the garden, looking at the house, understanding that such a house has actually a big bowl of fruit on top, that is the 1960 building that it stands below. This is not a unique typology. We did a lot of those because a few years ago the market started going crazy in Portugal. The prices went skyrocket high. So if you were a small investor looking for a house, you would probably buy a garage and just transform it. And this was another one where an illegal construction was removed from the back, and it has 2 levels. But the 2 levels, they are added together as a single window, somehow giving it a scale it never had. So imagine the biggest window in Porto for the smallest house. This sort of strategy. And once again, a very clear ending to our intervention, and then whatever happens above, happens above. And a third one, these are actually these three projects are in the same city block. They are all 50 meters away from each other. And once again, back facades. Every facade I'm showing is a back facade. When I show a front facade, I will let you know. But it's always about showing facades that, except for you and the users, no one knows. And in this case, it's a facade of an old garage, not a garage, sorry, a tool depot, a place where they used to store tools, that is transformed into a house. And this house opens a big square window in the middle. This square window is composed by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 windows. Around the remaining opaque window is cladded in mirror. And then in about 1 meter 20, several layers of materials and metal and stairs, they deconstruct what is often a very flat construction. But most important, the reflection gives us 20 meters of depth by giving us the reflection of the tree that is in the opposite side of the building itself. It's a main facade for private use, once again, a facade that somehow conflicts with the context where plaster and paint somehow dissimulate every single decision. Because as I said, within our regulation, we do not have any single law that talks about what happens on the back. And at the end of the day, everything changes, and suddenly the house becomes a ghost of itself, and whoever is moving and somehow behaving within the building is participating in the perception of the building on the garden. And this idea of light through negatives, it's very dear to us. So while doing this continuous research on the Japanese generation of the 70s, and in this case of the early 80s, these wireframes from Itsuko Asegawa became very valuable to us. There's a lot to learn from them. There's a lot we have been investigating. And while designing the house, not just on the facade, but on the interior, we tried for the first time at the time to draw through a wireframe. Is it possible not to do a wireframe, not to do a 3D model and then wireframe it, to design through a wireframe? So to make what I said we do with our students, to make the drawing a project and hope that the building that will result from such drawing is going to work altogether. And the house is very deep. It's about 25 meters deep by 5 meters wide. So all the walls are glass bricks, so they are all translucent, which means that the action of turning on a light or wearing a red shirt has an impact on the life of everyone else that lives with you. The risers are cladded, this is a riser, are cladded in mirror. The kitchen is cladded in mirror and striped as a sort of Luis Borges animal that is inhabiting the house before the inhabitants themselves. The staircase that goes over the building is painted in red, lipstick red. So in order not to see it, you make it so evident that it stops being what it is and it becomes a flying red prism. And as you go down to the basement, that is just 2.10 meters wide, you have a series of other programs that hide behind another glass brick wall. But because it's so dark, in this case, the light of the common area is given by the artificial lights of the secondary programs and vice versa. And of course, if you have a very low space, you make the handle very, very big of each door so that it feels even smaller, so that you compress even more your feelings. And the same way we did some houses that are very dark or that have to deal with the absence of enough light. We have done houses that have way too much light, that have way too much transparency, that look too far into the view. This is a house we finished just a couple of months ago. And the main requirement from the clients was a glass box to see the sea, because you can see the sea in the horizon very, very far. And we felt that it was an opportunity for us to think about what a glass box means. Because I mean, there are 1,000 glass boxes designed all over history, and they are profoundly boring and dull. And every time you look at the Farnsworth house, it kind of makes us puke, because it's an absence of architecture. It's an absolute idea, but with an absence of design. And so we tried as much as possible to bring other references into the mix. Some from Switzerland again, some from America, some from Japan, and trying to understand that making a glass box does not mean having no structure, it means hiding the structure. What if we don't? And having a glass box means having shading problems because you never have enough surface to hide it. What if we don't? And having a glass box normally means doing a house that is a bit low so that you can control these problems. What if we don't? And so we did a glass house that tries to contradict such principles. And the whole construction device is very archaic in a way, very basic. For example, to solve technical problems, we had skirting on the ceiling for, something we have never done before. But it felt to us like the right solution. And on the bottom, it's a house of three structures. The ground level, because the house is 13 meters high, so the ground level has the basement and let's say the private spaces of without natural light. The middle level is a grid of private rooms, so bedrooms, let's say, bathrooms, so secondary spaces. And on the top level, there's an opaque corner with circulation and services, and then three corners that are open towards the view. And as you move away from the house, you understand that the house is actually, the bottom level disappears under the garden. The middle level just reveals the windows of the secondary spaces, and the living room becomes this sort of floating glass box in a context where constructions are mostly poor and non-designed, and then it just disappears in the middle of the trees. So the transparency and the reflection, they kind of blend in. And this is I think the smallest house we designed so far. It's a house for my brother. My brother is our landscape architect, and the only thing he asked was that he wanted a garden, which makes sense because he's a landscape architect. And the house belonged to my great-grandfather, and as you can see in this context, all the houses were the same. They were more or less the same as this. You can see that. But over the years, every single user, because these were houses of 25 square meters, they added to the house. Some of them, as you can see on the bottom, they almost build another house behind. Most of them just build illegal metal annexes, constructions. We felt that it was an interesting opportunity to celebrate both. In a way, to keep the main alignments that were given, to extend to the back, but instead of doing just the brick building plus the metal annex, to make it all as a metal construction. Very light, and above all, very cheap, because that's how we justified it. On the back, the facade is, like most buildings around, a collection of elements. A beam, a column, a shutter, a bit of color. The column doesn't hold anything, once more. There's a mirror that hides the chimney. There's a few metal pieces here and there. As you can see, the house deviates a bit from the neighbor for practical reasons, but it is a celebration of a context. It is a contextual building of sorts. In section, the building is 3.5 meters wide by about 11 meters deep. So it is a very narrow, continuous building. On the street side, you enter through the bedroom, which is highly polemical for my mother. She does not like to go to my brother's house because she does not like to see his bed. And then after you see the bedroom, you enter to the living space at the lowest point of the house that gives you the maximum height. And why? Because there was no money to do a mezzanine. Very simple. But not having money, sometimes it's a great opportunity because it allows us to do one of the richest spaces we can. Because it's not very common that you can do a 5 meters tall space inside a 35, 36 square meters final house. And then the same highest point goes back to the lowest height and then frames the window. And this space, so this void that is above us, that is also very special here, is what we believe to be a strong manifesto for our office in the last few years. How to, through lack of resources and through a certain limitation of means, we can do something so strong. And that's why we chose this image as the cover of our A+U. In 5-10 years from now, I assume we would choose a completely different image, the same way we would have chosen another one 5 years before. But at this moment, where this crisis of housing and economy of means and limited resources is so much the theme, and intelligence is at stake, we believe that photographing nothing, so photographing a void, photographing a thing that was not there to be shown, is an important statement. And as I said before, we love architecture, but we love architecture to a level that is not healthy. We are geeks to an extreme that it's almost complicated sometimes to deal with the normal aspects of life and conditions. And this is a house from Venturi Scott Brown from 1969 that we admire tremendously, that for those who don't know was built in a specific place in America, but then put on a boat and taken somewhere else because someone bought the house, and being a wood structure, they managed to carry it for thousands of kilometers on a boat. And we thought the idea was very strong for two reasons. First of all, this house is a masterpiece, and we know it by heart, we know it by chance. And second of all, the idea of transporting the house to another place felt very dear to us. So we did the same. We took the plan at 1:1 scale, but instead of carrying it on a boat, because it has been done, we cannot do exactly the same thing, and we did not have the money to buy the original house, what if we just cookie cut it? What if we trim for our project the amount of house we need and make it fit the program, or we make the program fit to the house we have? And the house is now built, or finishing construction, to an American client, of course, in the north of Portugal. But we felt that just cookie cutting the house was not enough, so we played like Venturi did, like Caesar did, with scale. So the bottom level got even smaller, the top level got even higher, and then there's the stair that is taking you all the way to the sky. On the inside, profound abstraction, because the photos that Venturi Scott Brown left us are very difficult to understand in terms of materiality. And on the outside, the same lightness of the wood that was in the shingles around the house defines now the texture of the concrete that defines this house. And the house is now in its final stages of construction, and we hope to have finished photos of the interiors very soon. But this idea of the decorated box and the duck, this is a duck, this is the decorated box, has been very present with us, and Venturi Scott Brown have been very present with us. And the idea that you have to do a housing project for the market to sell, it's very difficult, because the client wants the maximum. That's the only thing he wants. No client ever asks for the minimum, except on the budget, but everything else is the maximum volume, maximum height, maximum. And when you do that, more often than not, when you apply that over urban planning, you get a box. But a box can be more than just a box. And so in the years that we have been designing buildings from scratch, we have been trying very hard to understand how to play with the surface and how to bring, with about 10% of surface, nobility to the totality of the building. In this case, once again, with stone, with proportion, with a curtain facade that suggests visually the hanging of the windows all over. The plan, very systematic, 5 houses with equal rooms or equal secondary rooms at the top, and the least important space, the connection space between private areas, becomes the formal expression that then attacks the plan. And that brings us to Kelly and to the idea of how this time the frame is not just a given frame in the sense of a rectangle that you cannot play with, but the frame is the set of lines that you use to define such square and such rectangle. And last but not least, structural structure also became more and more present. So in the sense that more often than not, because we noticed that in a commercial project, if you do a column that holds nothing, it's going to disappear. They're going to take it away. So put it in the most annoying space and make it structural, because if they cut it, they lose the house. So we started playing a bit with that. We started copying the staircase of Soto de Mora, the handrail from Caesar, the plan from Eli Mosayebi. So all of these things, they kind of came together in a very natural manner. The material palette is the one from the contractor, so there's not a lot we can do about it, but there's enough you can control to do something special out of it. At the same time in Porto, the opposite. Imagine a housing building where every single apartment is different from each other, coming from the difficulties of the site, topography, the staircase, the regulation, how to fit handicap accessibility, etc., and how to make an apartment that no one else in the world will have. And then when you look at it from the outside, you understand that that's possible when you go in, but it's not possible when you go out, because when you go out, it's a box. The city is made out of boxes, because urban planning loves boxes. But this box can have a pyjama pattern, and this pyjama pattern can give a very bidimensional surface a quite rich expression. And more often than not, going back to urban planning, there's no urban planning. You have to fill the gap. There's a building on the left, a building on the right, all the alignments are defined, and we have to play with that. In this case, you see front and back, and the same facade with the same proportions, but the shifting of a pattern is gonna do the trick. And on the inside, how to look back and forth, how to look to the two ways, how to have apartments that give you light in the morning from one side and in the afternoon from the other side, but both of them being shared all the way through. And these are the typologies we are talking about, so giving social spaces the possibility of, by opening a double door, connecting all the way through, but not necessarily solely in the Zurich school sense, but also in this sort of Kamiwada from Toyo Ito sense, the deconstruction of the meaning space, how to make the living not necessarily about a space for a table and a space for a sofa and a space for a TV and a fireplace, but the living space as a collection of wider and larger and thinner and narrower spaces that allows for multiple interpretations. And also form, of course. And then how to do that when you apply to a typical level project, when the project repeats several times on top of itself, and how the crossing living room, facing the view of the street with the kitchen and facing the view of the garden with the living, allows you to enter at the center of the house and be in connection with every single program at once, removing corridors, etc. This is, of course, the culmination of kind of parallel research of the last few years between the symbolical Japanese spaces and the very practical Swiss typologies from Zurich. It has took us through a dilemma between the opaque nature of these Japanese houses and the very permeable nature of these Swiss apartments, through a sense of clear geometry, because that's, you know, the way how you draw a plan in Japan is drastically different from the way how you deconstruct a plan in Switzerland. The real and the virtual. Real, you know, it's a photo from Jeff Wall, which is not real. Everything is composed, and every time we design an apartment, we are composing the Jeff Wall perspective of such apartment. But at the same time, the virtual condition, that is the adding up of projects and the definition of a city. The life and the still life. So our life finds its space within the most unpractical of houses, and at the same time, a painting or a house becomes in itself a sort of still life. And last but not least, in this set of duos, the difference between clocks and clouds, between buildings and projects. And this, you know, for some time we thought it was the same thing. We thought our role was to do buildings, and we got a bit lost in time. And no, our role is to do projects, and buildings will result from such projects. And this understanding that took a few years to come into place is today very, very evident to us. And the building itself is a one-to-one model of the project. So we ignored the building as a final ending, and we started seeing the building just as a means to an end and not as an end in itself. And this is a project we are now finishing construction in Porto, a housing block, once again in between buildings, you know, maximum height defined, maximum depth defined, everything is defined by the city, so there's not a lot you can do. And the building has a system of its own, it has a series of rules, it has a series of conditions that I'm not going to present now. It is a modern structure, it has concrete columns, concrete slabs, and it has bricks. It has stripes. It is trying very hard with a few parameters that can disobey to the urban setting to do so. And it's going to disappear as the background for the city. Because as much as we talk about it, as much as we celebrate it, in the end it's just going to be another one of those buildings that the same way I criticize my neighbors will criticize in the future. And in the last few years, we did a lot of public competitions for public housing, because the European Union gave a lot of money to Portugal to build, to rebuild the country post-COVID, and the country decided to build public housing. And these competitions were done in collaboration with POMO and with Experimental, friends of ours from Porto. And out of 18 competitions, we won 3. And these 3 competitions, we always showed them like this. We won with a certain project, the competition, but then we had 3 years to make the real project happen. And that's why we always like to keep them a bit vague. They are now moving towards construction. One already under construction, the other one moving to tendering now, and the last one in execution documents. And these are buildings that have 50, 48, and 150 apartments. So we are talking about 250 apartments at once, where every single one of these blocks is bigger than everything we ever did before. So scale plays a role here. So typology plays a role, repetition, systematization. And then how to apply all the ideas and the investigation that we accumulated over the years in a specific project that is public, with defined funding, with a contractor that we cannot call and just talk with a public space that is given. So buildings that anyone can visit and appreciate. These are buildings that are very systematic, so the same section does pretty much all of them, the same constructive details. So we have been working seriously on the definition of a principle that can do them all. The way how the plans are drawn and on the systematization of metrics and typologies arranged is also quite important. Always with the idea that the living space goes through, once again, like you saw before, and that the few exceptions that we need to include, be them a column or an extra room, they find their way in, but always activating the center of the house as part of the house. In the other one, this one with 150 apartments, whoever is cooking, whoever is eating, whoever is watching TV, I apologize, they are in a relation, so cooking is not a segregated function for someone else to do while someone else watches TV. And if the doors of the bedrooms are open, the same thing happens between private bedrooms, and if just one couple lives here, the office space of this room is also in relation with whoever is cooking. So there's an ambition to connect in an apartment that is just 65 square meters or 75 square meters, they are very small, to give this connection possibility. And the last of them in Lisbon, allowing that two symmetrical equal spaces, by putting the kitchen in the center, allow for this connection with the balcony but also with the gallery, and two bedrooms allow for this vis-a-vis to happen. And the bedroom size is calculated by the size of the vertical circulation, so very, very efficient game. And this is what we are looking for. At the center of the apartment, if you look to the left, you will see the view. If you are at the end of the apartment in the living room and you look to the kitchen, you will see the kitchen. So going through, connecting, not the stupid idea that bedrooms are on one side, living rooms are on the other side, corridors and bathrooms in the middle, blocking the relation between both. Exactly the opposite. Opening the door of your bedroom and being the living space. This is highly polemical in Portugal, but I think it's truly fundamental to be tested and presented, because otherwise we're going to design the same apartment forever and ever. The same in another project, so going through, connecting, being related, so every bedroom is an opportunity of relation with the rest of the house. The typical detailing, the relation of the column and the window, the typical door that is exactly the same in all projects, so there's no time to draw carpentries. There's one door, and this door is going to do all the projects, but each project has a contractor, so you can have different colors. And then the wireframe, seeing everything at the same place at the same time. And all of these buildings, they have very important mask facades, because the typical detail of the facade, the typical window repeats itself endless times. So by doing a very nasty, thick window frame that is actually very cheap, you can afford the right amount of glass so that you can have a fully glazed facade, giving more depth, more light, more life to these apartments that are by default quite small. And in the end, it's a bit of Lacaton Vassal, Ettore Sozzas, and a few other things at the same time. So it's practical, it's industrial, but it's happy. So it's not trying to be a sad facade that just talks about technology, it's trying to talk about happiness. And these three projects, they were designed at the same time, and so we tried as much as possible to relate them, to make them make sense as a group. And this Baldassari artwork where he throws three balls in the air trying to align them made a lot of sense to us as a conceptual reference. And another project we were doing simultaneously that is now built, so a project with three buildings of different needs, a small house, a medium house, and a collective space for activities, follows the same principle. How the same facade, the same detailing, the same, let's say, construction can produce buildings of different sizes. And the buildings, they are made with pieces of other buildings, so a plan from Ito, a plan from Gary, a plan from Cisa. And when these buildings are taken out of context, they are just lines, and these lines organize the left side of the buildings, the private rooms, the rooms that are Baroque, and on the right side they are just open and free. So there's a full side and an empty side. The full side is very dense, it's very rich, it's full of difficult corners and not with a lot of light. And then the main side is completely empty. It's a side that is just about the functions that will happen within it. As you go away from the building, the columns hold the structure and they relate with the landscape. And within the landscape, you understand that actually these buildings are sunken. So the three semicircles, they are a rhetorical exercise. The relation between full and empty is something that I can talk about, but no one can understand. It's an exercise of architecture from architecture. But when you move away from the farmlands to the city center, there's a building that is 3 levels high, but feels to be 7 levels high. So as you can see on the neighbor, this is a normal height of a building, 3. This one is a bit too high, but it's actually the same height. And it's a building that plays with split levels. So there's a staircase at the center, and this staircase does a trick that the Estonia embassy also does here in Lithuania, in Vilnius, where by doing that you have the minimum amount of circulation, the maximum amount of use, because the building is just 4.5 meters deep, and you get more rooms because of that. And the way how the plan is drawn means that all the windows are aligned, and there's a certain system, like a mathematical equation, and in that mathematical equation a few lines are added. And these lines are like the lines from Robert Mengel, lines that deal again with the definition and the tension of a canvas and the form of such canvas. And all of these walls that are added to rectangle are glass brick. And by being glass brick, they allow light to move in, they allow the relationship of the body and the color and the light between rooms, and they give the rooms a tension that if these were opaque walls would not have. And at the end, the house ends In a crown, the crown is a semicircle. This semicircle is the last moment where the frieze ends the system and you just see connecting, for the first time in the house, the relationship between the full length of the house. In a completely different context, in Porto, in a place where no one would buy a piece of land, because although very cheap, it's very difficult to build and very difficult to access. Lara, my partner in the office, she bought a piece of land and she built a house. And this is inside a city block that no one cares about. That's why they allowed us to do this. So in a place where you don't care, you can do better than in the places where people tend to care. And you can see that the context is very harsh. You know, there's no sidewalks, there's no proper pavements, most of the constructions are very poor, electrical connections are flying above buildings. But why not? The house itself is polemical in a sense that you enter through the bedroom level and then you go up to the living space. This allows us to have the bedroom level at 2.6 and the living room at 3.4, so it's very, very tall, although in footprint it's just 45 square meters. So it's a very small house with a very vertical space. As you can see, two windows, the window of the living and the window of the bedroom, are connected, defining just a single shape, once again doing one big window out of two smaller windows. And inside the house is made of several accidents, be it the staircases, the cabinets, the patterns, the lines that define the handrails, a big column at the center. And the house is a celebration of this explosion. And when you look at it from the wireframe perspective, all of these shapes seem to clash, and they are not that different from the context in which the house operates. From the outside, it's very opaque, it's very close, it's a kind of house within a house, but from the outside it's very, very, very protected. And in a similar context, not that far, a small house that was actually an architecture office from a professor of mine for many years is transformed into a new house. As you can see, it's the smallest house of the street, which explains why it has a hat. It has a hat because it's trying very hard to stand on its toes. It's a very cheap project. It's done with catalog materials. It has windows that do not belong, so aluminium windows on a protected building. It's quite polemical. But it's a very celebrative project. You see, these are the plans that we found, and there was so little money that the only thing we did was to add a structural line at the center to compensate the wood structure that was bending, and a couple of walls to solve bathrooms, and that's it. But every single square centimeter of the surfaces were painted. So very little was added physically, but a lot was added visually. And visually you can add paint, you can add elements, but you can also add mirrors. Mirrors help to deconstruct and to duplicate spaces. The structural elements that were added, they appear where you would least expect them, but actually at the most efficient locations. Yes, this is a structure that actually holds something. And this is what is added to the building: a new roof, a few new windows, and a few structural elements. But the project happens in the tension between old and new. So what was there and what was added and how they coexist. And as you go through the different rooms, the relationship of the structure causes different accidents. But this relationship between an old shutter, a new window frame, the necessary structure, and all the surfaces cladded either in paint or mirror or wood, creates a tension that we believe that is very important for a house that is both new and old, or solely new now. The front and the back facade, photographed at night by Francisco, suggesting the importance of color, so referring to color as an active device. And as you go around on the back, it's still the smallest of the neighborhood, and it celebrates its hat with another hat that is a small hat. A few meters away again in Porto, a big warehouse that becomes a house. A warehouse that becomes a house mostly through economical factor. It's a cheap property. It's a property that is bought in a good time. And then it's renovated with very little resources. As you can see here, what is removed and added, and the final plan gives you in the front a tiny building that was already there with concrete walls, with concrete slabs that keeps the private programs, the guest programs. So if the brother of the client goes there, he sleeps in front. Then there's a piece of building that is removed that defines a garden, an endless living space, and then the private spaces of the client. So it's bedroom, it's bathroom, etc. And what happens in the project is the tension between the compression at the ends and the decompression at the center gives the client the biggest living room in Porto, probably in Portugal, maybe in the world, I don't know, because it's 800 square meters of living space. So it's just it's bigger than this one. It's not taller than this one, but it's so big. It's completely out of scale. The fireplace is too big, the kitchen is too big, the door at the end is too big, the windows everything is too big, just because there was no money. which is kind of paradoxical, right? You don't have enough money, so you get the biggest living room in the world. And as you go around to the other side, and scale plays a role, and the feet of the kitchen that are very small, and the feet of the fireplace that are very big, so everything is about perception. So when you walk around the house, you completely lose track of how big the house really is. And this is a very special project for us. And on the outside, it's a warehouse, it's a factory, and this factory is painted on its surfaces to get a face, and it's painted on the ceiling with plastic roof that talks to the sky and to the birds, that you can also see from the bridge when you get to Porto. So it has a very plastical appeal, trying very hard to say something to the city and not just to itself. And when you go around, you understand it's in a very decaying part of the town, where the paint of the facade becomes a defining factor for its personality. I think this is the last project. 200 meters away, close to the train line, so a few meters higher in the city, one of the buildings we are finishing construction now, facing one of the hardest cuts in the city you can find in Porto. The building is a housing block for a promoter, so it's a project that has no political or social agenda, it just wants profit. So, based on the regulation of when it was designed in 2016, it's an old project, the promoter asked us for the maximum amount of units, which means 15 units according to our regulation. They are about 35 square meters, so very small but very compact units. And as you can see from the structure of the plan, it's very repetitive, it's very systematic, it's the same rectangle several times. So imagine 35 square meters means 10, 11 by 3.5. It's not that much. It's very small. Compared to this space, it's very, very small. But in section, it's the same height as this. So it's 7.5 meters high, which means that in reality, you have the smallest apartment in Porto with the tallest section. And every single apartment has a different section, allowing that 15 different users will have 15 different living experiences. We hope they don't fill them with mezzanines and with substructures, etc. That space is space. But it's a very interesting factor now to have guests and to have visitors on these apartments and having them discussing which one they like the most. Some prefer the cat, some prefer this, some prefer that. But it's always the same apartment. The first 2.5 meters are exactly the same in all of them. The second 5 meters, not so much. And as you go through, the same material palette does all the apartments. So the sides in white, the tops in dark blue, ceiling in concrete, and the floor in striped terrazzo. It's a very cheap palette, it's a very cheap building, so it's being built with about 900 euros square meter, I think, which for new construction today, it's still quite low. And as you go through the different apartments, they have similar, different expressions. And one of them is the maximum apartment that has a flying column. But when you see the 15 of them, they are so repetitive, as again, the same plan, the same material palette, the same colors, the same finishes, but they are different from each other. So if you show us a photo, if you take a photo with your phone and you show it to anyone in the office, we know exactly which apartment it is. So this idea that space can be unique 7, 8 years ago when we designed this project was very important. And over the years, what changed was a material palette that became even cheaper, but more present than it started. Here, there are some photos from 2 or 3 days ago of the construction that is almost there. And all the bathrooms are also different. So not only all the living rooms are different, all the bathrooms are unique. And as you look at the building as a wireframe, you can see the blue lines that give you the repetition of the module, and then you can see the pink lines, the elements that show up and disrupt such rule. And when you see the photo of the construction, this is as close as we can get to a wireframe on a construction site. You can see the domino structure, very repetitive, and then you can see the lines, the cat, the curve, the steps, all of them showing up here and there. Concrete is very cheap in Portugal. Concrete, stone, heavy work. So the rougher the work, the more affordable it is to us. Wood is expensive, metal is expensive. So we have to find the balance between those. And here you see the photo from the air, and you understand that the volume of the factory is the volume of an old factory. So the factory that was there had to be demolished, it was removed, but we had the legal right to preserve such volume. And because we keep such volume, but legally we can only build half of its square meterage, what we end up is with twice the cubic meters that we need for the building. That's why we managed to justify this to the client. Because this way, if we were to demolish the factory and not keep the volume, we would have to build a small building against the street with half the area. So it's in a way, it's a very stupid project because there's stupid regulation that allows us to do great things. And on the back you can see there's a cat. And the cat is important for several reasons. It is important because it provides a very exceptional section to the last apartment. It is important because by doing the cat, it allows this apartment to have a patio that has a phenomenal view towards the east. And it's important because there's the metro line, there's the train line, and there's the highway line passing by. So about 2 million people see this back facade every day, while about 100 people see the front facade every day. So on the front facade, it's a beautiful rectangle like the city likes, but on the back facade is a cat. And everyone that passes on the street, and we already got emails about this asking, is the cat yours? So there's a recognition of the manifesto, and we believe that it's important that a kid that sees a building between factories among the trees sees a cat and not another endless rectangle. And when you pass on, this is what I was talking about. When you pass on the highway, the cat is somehow there. It's not finished yet, but it starts to feel like it's gonna feel. And to finish, this is the last project these are photos from last week, I think, so very, very recent. It's an apartment. So going back to the beginning, renovating a small apartment for clients that just want to transform a relatively banal property they bought. This apartment ends in a patio. This patio is relatively small, and in a nasty place, but they still wanted to have a small bathtub outside. But then there's the building above, so everyone is going to see them taking a shower on that bathtub. And so what we did is that we opened the apartment transversally, so like these experiments I showed before. All the elements that are celebrated, they are cladded in a certain stone or mirror, you can see here. So deconstructing the elements we want to deconstruct and celebrating the elements we want to celebrate. As you can see on the right, the plan is a continuous step that goes back to some of the tests from Toyoito. But what I want to show up at the end is the solution for them to take a shower outside. So a metal cloud that flies above the bathtub that gives you shadow from the south and gives you some visual protection from the neighbors above. And I would end with this image and with this quote. Manzoline said in 1968 that everything is architecture. And by everything, I would say, to take on their sentence, drawings, plans, photographs, collages, buildings even are architecture. So we took the quote as ours, and this is how we see our production today. Thank you so much.